And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Welcome to another totally normal weekday in the Donald J. Trump presidency. Totally normal day, right? When I went to bed last night, I thought the big suspenseful news event of the day, the one event on today's calendar that had the biggest potential for real drama, was going to be the hearing in the criminal case involving President Trump's campaign chairman. Paul Manafort, already convicted on multiple felonies, already facing a likely prison sentence of 7 to 10 years. The drama underlying today's hearing for Manafort is that he could be facing an additional decade in prison on top of the 7 to 10, which really, I mean, when you start adding it up, that could be the whole enchilada if you're already 70 years old and not in great health. He is facing an additional decade in prison, potentially on top of his other sentence, if the judge in his case concludes that he breached his plea agreement by lying to prosecutors after he had agreed to cooperate with them. So Manafort himself was in court today. We got these great sketches by Art Lane, the great courtroom artist. Manafort was allowed, as you can see here, was allowed to wear a suit this time instead of his jail jumpsuit. He is now white-haired. As you can see, he's using a cane. Reporters who were at the hearing today described him as leaning heavily on that cane. But with all the prosecutors there, and with Manafort's whole defense team there, and with Manafort himself in the courtroom, everybody there in person today, in federal court in D.C. today, the judge in his case ultimately elected to not today make a decision on the substance of these current allegations against him, which again are that he broke his deal by lying repeatedly to prosecutors. So Manafort was there in court today. He then had to go back to jail. He will be back in court a week from Monday, and then that will be the day that this same judge will finally conduct a hearing behind closed doors to determine whether Manafort really is going to be on the hook for all of these extra years potentially tacked onto his sentence. So that's going to be a closed-door, sealed hearing a week from Monday, and it is going to be sealed because of the sensitivity around Manafort's testimony thus far and how much of his criminal case still bears upon other still ongoing investigations and other people who have not yet been charged. Remember, Paul Manafort has done at least 9 interview sessions with the special counsel's office. He has testified before the grand jury at least twice. We will ultimately get some redacted transcript of that Manafort hearing after they've gone through and taken out all the sensitive stuff. But they're holding that next Manafort hearing behind closed doors because they're expecting a lot of it to not yet be suitable for public consumption because of all of the ongoing cases that it relates to. And it tells you something about this presidency and this moment in American history, that the sitting president's campaign chairman turning up in court today with white hair, using a cane, trying to avoid the extra decade in prison that could determine whether or not he dies behind bars. It tells you something about this time period we are living through and this presidency we are living through, that doesn't make the front page today for this particular president. It doesn't make probably the first 10 pages of the paper tomorrow morning. Because on a day like today, it just couldn't compete. When the government shutdown crisis finally started to end today, with the president appearing in the Rose Garden to announce that the government will reopen under its old funding levels with no change in policy whatsoever, with no freaking wall between the United States and Mexico, or a down payment on it, or a sample portion of it, or any other thing related to a wall whatsoever. When the president announced today that he will accept the exact same offer he rejected over a month ago, that started this whole catastrophe for the government and for hundreds of thousands of people who work for the government and their families. When the president today made that announcement that he said he would never, ever make, which is that the shutdown will end in exchange for him getting absolutely nothing. When that dark cave opened up on the White House lawn today and swallowed all light and made it briefly, eerily cold and breezy for a moment, what that moved off the front page of every newspaper in the country and off every moment of TV news in the country was not just what was going on at that moment with his already convicted campaign chairman. It also moved this: the indictment of the president's longtime friend and longest-serving political advisor, the self-promoting Republican Party gadfly, Roger Stone. We will be talking about the end of the shutdown tonight. at the moment that the president declared the end of the shutdown today, it displaced from the headlines momentarily this indictment. Roger Stone was actually, it turns out, indicted yesterday under seal. The special counsel's office had requested that the federal court in D.C. keep that indictment secret yesterday, keep it under seal until Stone could be arrested this morning. Quote, "The United States of America, by and through special counsel Robert S. Mueller III, respectfully moves this court to seal the accompanying indictment and arrest warrant and to delay entry on the public docket of this motion to seal and all related matters until the defendant named is in custody." Quote, "Law enforcement believes that publicity resulting from the disclosure of this indictment prior to arrest will increase the risk of the defendant fleeing and destroying or tampering with evidence. It is therefore essential that any information concerning the pending indictment in this district be kept sealed prior to the defendant's arrest. These facts present an extraordinary situation and a compelling governmental interest that justifies not only the sealing of the indictment and all other pleadings, warrants, records, and files in this case, but also a short delay in the public docketing of these sealed proceedings and the accompanying order until the defendant's arrest." So that is dated yesterday from the special counsel. That's the special counsel saying to the judge, this indictment should be sealed. Our request to seal the indictment should be sealed. This should all be kept off the docket until we've got him. And the judge apparently agreed, because the first sign that we all got of what happened today to Roger Stone was when this footage was caught on video by a CNN producer who had been assigned by the network to essentially stake out Roger Stone's house in the event that anything like this might happen. And this in itself is sort of a remarkable milestone in the Mueller investigation. We've seen a lot of people charged in this case and marched in and out of courthouses. We have seen them in SUVs pulling in and out of parking lots outside government buildings. Their movements have been tracked even around potential testimony before secret grand juries. But nobody else got arrested by the FBI in this fashion. I mean, even when they raided Paul Manafort's house in Virginia, remember all the drama about that? When they took away his files and his computers and his iPads and his nice suits and his ostrich jacket and everything, at least then they left Paul Manafort himself behind. This is the first time where we have actually seen them grab the dude from his house and take him into custody. Now, we do not have to speculate as to why the special counsel's office and the FBI chose to do it this way. The special counsel's office laid out their reasons in their motion to seal. Right? They told that judge in D.C. yesterday they believed Roger Stone would flee and or destroy or tamper with evidence if he knew that he was being indicted. And so, surprise, they arrested him before dawn today. And yes, if you are trying to snip every loose thread here, yes, you're right. Because that happened in the pre-dawn hours today, hours before the proclaimed end of the government shutdown, it is likely that those FBI agents who arrested Roger Stone today did so while not being paid. But now we have got the unsealed indictment for Roger Stone. It lays out 7 felony charges against him. Nothing about the indictment suggests that Stone has previously had any contact at all with the special counsel's office, which is interesting. It doesn't appear that Mueller ever bothered to interview Roger Stone before indicting him today. But Stone is charged today with lying to Congress and with attempting to intimidate another witness to either lie to Congress or refuse to testify to Congress. All of the charges against Stone today and the narrative that prosecutors lay out that supports the indictment, it all relates to Stone's contacts and communications during the presidential campaign related to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks, of course, distributed the documents that Russian military intelligence stole from the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign. Roger Stone is alleged in this indictment to have lied to Congress repeatedly about his own efforts to communicate with WikiLeaks, both personally and through intermediaries. He's also alleged to have lied about whether or not his efforts to communicate with WikiLeaks were done on his own say-so, on his own initiative, or whether the Trump campaign put him up to it. So we'll get some expert help on this tonight. A lot of people who followed this stuff most closely from a legal perspective are suggesting today and tonight that the Stone indictment is something that puts the central question of the Mueller investigation closer to President Trump and his campaign than any other indictment we have seen thus far. Again, we will get some expert help on that coming up in just a moment, including the significance of the fact that now yet another person close to the president has been charged with witness tampering in the Mueller investigation. And that is something where the president himself is sort of increasingly looking like he may have some legal problems of his own. Again, we will get to all of that. But I'm quite sure you've heard a lot about this case already today. Again, the arrest happened before dawn. We got the indictment early this morning. I'm not going to go through it here line by line. I'm not going to try to connect every dot and flesh out all of the sordid characters in this, partly because I can't stomach it, but also because there's really just two things that I want to focus on. And they're both open questions for me. But in terms of where my head is at, in terms of figuring out how this fits into the overall scandal and sort of how close we are to the end here and how close we are to getting the biggest and most important questions answered just for us as the American public, these are the two things that I am sort of stuck on. The first one is a dynamic, a pattern that we have seen over and over and over and over again in this scandal when it comes to people surrounding the president and even the president himself. This is something we saw from the very beginning, from December 2017, when Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn turned up in court, pleading guilty and agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors. What Mike Flynn admitted to lying about, remember, was his contact with the Russian government during the transition. His contact with the Russian government about U.S. sanctions on Russia. What never made sense about Flynn and him pleading guilty is why he felt the need to lie to the FBI about his contact with the Russian government and him talking to them about sanctions. I mean, at the time he had that contact with the Russian government, he was the incoming national security advisor. And yeah, maybe it was a little weird that before he was technically sworn in, he was already having policy discussions with another government, but it's not that weird. I mean, had he just publicly asserted, yes, I talked to the Russian ambassador about sanctions. We on the Trump campaign have been clear about the fact that we have a different take on sanctions than the outgoing administration, and it was a matter of urgency. I mean, had Flynn said something like that, that would have occasioned like half a raised eyebrow. But instead, he lied about it multiple times to the FBI. I mean, what about those communications with the Russian government were so, what? I mean, intrepid? Embarrassing? Linked to a larger thing you didn't want to have to explain? I mean, what about those communications with the Russians were worth lying about? There was nothing wrong about them on their face, so why lie about it? Why lie to the FBI about it? That became a question that was even harder to answer when we learned that it wasn't just Mike Flynn who lied about those communications with the Russian government about sanctions. The Washington Post reported months later that Flynn's deputy, KT McFarland, had also made false statements to the FBI about the same thing, denying the truth about those contacts with the Russian government during the transition when they talked to them about sanctions. She lied about it to reporters at the time. We later learned she also lied about it to the FBI. And again, there was nothing weird about talking to the Russian government about sanctions. So why create a big cover story about it? Why create a cover story that you stuck to the point where you open yourself up to potential criminal charges for lying about it? And it wasn't just the two of them. The New York Times later reported that within the transition, there were a whole bunch of Trump officials who were all read in on the truth, which was that Flynn was talking to the Russian government about sanctions during the transition. They were all read in on it. Among the Trump officials who were read in on that and sent emails documenting in detail what Flynn was doing with the Russians, among the people read in on that was Sean Spicer, who soon became the White House spokesman. Sean Spicer, too, knowing the real story, nevertheless gave the public a false story. He publicly spread this lie about Flynn's contact with the Russian government when we know that he was actually read in on what really happened. Why did they all tell lies about that? I mean, telling the truth about that would not have been a scandal. But yet there was this elaborate cover-up over a period of months involving multiple officials, multiple false statements, both in public and to reporters and even to federal law enforcement agents. And we have seen that dynamic over and over again in this scandal with characters large and small. Speaking of small, remember old George Papadopoulos, who's already served his prison sentence in this scandal? He's admittedly a very minor figure in this scandal, right? Well, what happened in his case is that we learned that he'd lied to federal investigators about the content and timing of his communications with somebody who claimed to be connected to the Russian government. And whatever you think about George Papadopoulos, he was attached to the Trump campaign. He was working as a declared foreign policy advisor for the campaign. Him having conversations with somebody who purported to be linked to the Russian government would not be crazy, would not be illegal. I mean, that's the sort of thing he could have admitted to without much need to explain further. But yet he lied about it to federal investigators. That's why he went to prison. He's sort of the small end of the food chain, right? Like, he's the grub. The great white shark in this food chain is, of course, the candidate at the top of that campaign. We saw this same dynamic at work with Trump himself. Now we know that through the presidential campaign, Trump and his business were pursuing a very large real estate deal in Russia, a Trump Tower Moscow deal that would have required the involvement of and the permission of the Russian government. Now we know that he and his business were pursuing that during the presidential campaign. And the president now says it's perfectly fine that he was doing that. After all, he's a real estate guy. He pursues real estate projects all over the world. That's what he does. And as he says, everybody thought he would lose the presidential election. So why should he forgo business opportunities that might otherwise elude him if he put his business career fully on hold while he was running for president? There was nothing wrong with him pursuing that deal. Right, that's what he says now. Whatever you think about that explanation from President Trump, that explanation would have held exactly the same amount of water during the campaign. Instead, for months, he explicitly lied and said he wasn't pursuing any deals in Russia. It wasn't illegal for him to pursue a real estate deal in Russia. He has proved himself capable of spinning a story about that makes it sound okay, or at least tries to make it sound okay. But for months, he lied about it overtly. He tried to keep it secret. Michael Cohen went to Congress and answered questions about the Trump Tower Moscow project, knowing the exact truth of that project since he was somebody who was directly involved in it, as one of the principal people trying to put it together. He, nevertheless, under oath, told Congress lies about the Trump Tower Moscow project and how long it went on. Again, that project wasn't illegal. If there was something wrong with it, there was nothing more wrong with it in June than there was in January. Why did they have to invent a fake cover story for it that included committing felonies and lying under oath in order to keep it secret? What was it about that you had to tell a fake story about? You know, and it's all of them. I mean, when Jared Kushner filled out his security clearance application after the inauguration, why did he leave off that application that he had met with the Kremlin-appointed head of a Russian bank, that he had met multiple times with the Russian ambassador, that he'd taken that Trump Tower meeting during the campaign with all those Russians? I mean, all of those individual meetings and communications are things that Mr. Kushner has an explanation for. He and his well-paid spokespeople have since given all those explanations. You know, they all came up in the normal course of his work on the campaign, and in the transition, there was nothing untoward about any of them. Okay, then why did he keep them all secret? In Watergate, they said the cover-up was worse than the crime. In this scandal, the cover-up is the big red neon flashing arrow that points at where the crime might be. because time and time and time again, we have seen the same dynamic. All of them, up and down, have all been caught telling lies, even to the point of facing prison time for telling lies about things that on the surface are not worth lying about. Things that aren't illegal. Things that could have a totally normal explanation. And that is a neon sign shaped like an arrow pointing out what must be beneath the surface of those things, that they went to such lengths and took such risks to cover up. And so today, we see that again with Roger Stone. And, you know, there's a lot of color in the Stone indictment with him, like, you know, threatening that guy's dog when he was going to try to stop that guy from testifying to Congress. There's that kind of stuff. There's him quoting The Godfather, right? There's the big headline grabber from the indictment today, which is the allegation from the special counsel that Stone did not make his overtures to WikiLeaks on his own initiative. According to the special counsel, a senior campaign official was directed to contact Roger Stone to get him to find out what WikiLeaks had on Clinton. Everybody's now scratching their heads wondering who on a campaign would have the authority to direct a senior campaign official to make that kind of request. Everybody's wondering if the only kind of person with that authority in a campaign would be the candidate himself. Maybe, I don't know, we don't know. The special counsel doesn't say. But if you set all that aside for just a second, consider the overall dynamic that we've seen with all of these other figures in this scandal thus far. Lying about stuff that on the surface it doesn't seem like they'd need to lie about. Just look for a second in the Stone indictment at the specific allegations that are spelled out about what Stone lied about. Again, with all of the other people in this scandal, we have seen them again and again and again in their security clearance applications, with federal investigators, in FBI interviews, before Congress, under oath, risking prison time to tell lies about things that do not seem to be crimes, things that on the surface do not seem to be illegal, things that don't seem like they need to be lied about. Well, in this case, in this new indictment today, what Roger Stone is alleged to have lied about under oath, what he is alleged to have aggressively threatened this other witness that he needed to lie about it too, or not testify if he couldn't commit to not lying about it. What he's accused of, the big lie at the heart of the Stone indictment, is something really, really, really small and specific. What is spelled out in the indictment today is that Roger Stone appears to have concocted a cover story which said that the way he tried to get information from WikiLeaks was through this guy, a guy who Roger Stone knew, a guy who had a radio show on which he had interviewed Julian Assange from WikiLeaks. And so therefore, the cover story was that Roger Stone thought this guy could be a good contact to Julian Assange from WikiLeaks, right? If the guy could interview him, presumably he could also reach him to get information about what WikiLeaks had on the Clinton campaign. According to prosecutors today, that was the cover story that Roger Stone concocted and that he tried to sell to the House Intelligence Committee under oath. According to prosecutors today, that story is false. And the real story is that Stone actually dispatched this guy, different guy, to contact Julian Assange in order to figure out what WikiLeaks had on Clinton. Now, can we put those two guys up side by side? Yeah, okay, right. Again, bear with me here. I mean, this is the big lie that's spelled out in the indictment. Roger Stone says the guy on the right is how he tried to contact WikiLeaks. Actually, it was the guy on the left. Okay, who cares? Why does that matter? Why would the difference between those two paths to WikiLeaks be worth not only lying about it to Congress, but doing backflips and making all these florid, Baroque threats against another witness to prevent that cover story from unraveling? I mean, page 18 of the indictment today, Roger Stone goes nuts over the prospect that the cover story will be exposed as false and the real story will come out. Quote, "Stonewall it, plead the fifth, anything to save the plan." He tells this witness who's going to give up the cover story and explain that it wasn't really true. He tells him to refuse to appear, to take the fifth, to do a Frank Pentangeli, which is the guy in Godfather 2 who turns up to testify before Congress and then, surprise, refuses to testify about what he really knows. And he makes up a whole fake story to protect everybody else. Do a Frank Pentangeli. I mean, okay, what the heck was so important about the difference between those two stories? Honestly. I used radio show host Randy Credico to get to WikiLeaks versus I used Jerome Corsi, weird conspiracy theorist, to get to WikiLeaks. Who cares? Who cares? But that distinction between those two stories was apparently enough to risk all in 7 felony charges and getting arrested on CNN before dawn. And so now we have a new neon sign in the shape of an arrow blinking, pointing out what otherwise not seem to be illegal or even particularly scandalous behavior. What is it about this? What is it about this story that you have to go to these lengths to protect? This story, which doesn't seem to be anything scandalous, has nevertheless caused grown adults to risk years, if not decades, in prison to try to keep it under wraps. In this case, I mean, what the red neon arrow is pointing at is whatever this line of communication is that goes from the Trump campaign to Roger Stone to Jerome Corsi to WikiLeaks to Russian military intelligence. Right? WikiLeaks was distributing the anti-Clinton stuff that had been stolen by Russian intelligence. I have never cared about that before, but boy, do I now. Boy, do I now that I know the lengths to which these characters were willing to go to make sure that stayed secret. And briefly, there's just one last point to know about this Roger Stone indictment, which I think points us to what we may be able to expect next, or at least where we should look to figure that out. There was a way to know this indictment was coming. In mid-December, Carol Leonnig was a lead reporter on this story in the Washington Post, which reported that Robert Mueller had requested an official transcript of Stone's testimony to the House Intelligence Committee. Now, we reported that on this show the night of December 19th because it was the Washington Post suggesting pretty overtly in that story that that request from Mueller to get the official transcript, that might be a sign that Mueller was about to indict Roger Stone for lying in that testimony. That would explain why Mueller needed an official transcript of what Stone had said. That prediction from Carol Leonnig and her co-authors in the Washington Post in mid-December proved to be exactly right. He did get indicted for false testimony in that testimony that Mueller got the official transcript of in mid-December. Because of that, we spent today trying to figure out who else has had their transcript peeked at by special counsel Robert Mueller. What we found is not necessarily what you would expect, but I do think it tells us where we should look to see what's about to happen next. And we've got that little bit of news coming up. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.